Well, good afternoon to everybody. If you haven't met me, my name is Josh, and I'm a pastor here. Something else you may or may not know about me is I really love to read books. Absolutely love them. And I read a fantastic book recently. It was called The Table I Long For. The Table I Long For. And it was all about, I guess, church and community and what it is that we do. And it made me really think and reflect. And it made me laugh and cry what was in there. Because some of it just hit home. Some of it made me reflect on the state of our church and what we do as a community and what we do as gatherings. And it was a refreshing read as well. So if you were to read one book this year, The Table I Long For is an amazing book that I guess sort of puts into perspective what it means to be a church community. Because at the end of the day, it's not just the four walls that we're in, it's not just the seats that we sit on, but it's the table that we gather around and share life with each other. And there were some amazing and funny quotes from it. And it was nice to read because I read a lot of books that are written by other Christians and don't necessarily touch on the Adventist perspective. But this guy is an Adventist and he wrote on his Adventist perspective. And it was so funny, some of the things that I read in there were so true and sad at the same time. But one funny bit here, he says, instead of sending out our people to live God's mission, we send out handbills, hoping to attract strangers to our prophecy meetings, advertise with dragons and promises to explain what the mark of the beast is. Is that really what mission is? Is that really what it means to be a church community? Or is there something more to what it means to gather as people of God? Is there something more in what it means to follow God? And so this afternoon, I just sort of want to reflect on what it means to be a church community, what it looks like to do life together. And so I'm just going to share some observations, share some readings that I've come across, share some thoughts from Scripture as well. And so the title of this, funnily enough, we should have been in tables here, but didn't have the time to do that. But circles are better than rows is what I've titled this, because I sort of want to reflect on what it means to gather together. Kerry Newhoff, he is an amazing Christian writer and thinker, and he always has amazing articles that come out and that make you think and reflect on the state of what we're doing. And he writes this. He says, churches that love their method more than their mission will die. Churches that love their method more than their mission will die. And I find so often that in our church, and in our gatherings, in our communities, we're so set on doing things a particular way that it's the be-all and end-all, and that's what we have all these fights and arguments about, rather than communicating and spreading and sharing the message of the gospel. It's about our way of doing things in a particular set order, in a particular set way, at a particular set time, or is it about sharing the love of Christ? Is our mission just to fill this church building? I mean, it'd be nice to have it full, but did Jesus call us to that, or did Jesus call us to something else? 168. It's the amount of hours in a week. And when we get to church on Saturday, we maybe spend 1, 2, maybe 4 hours if you spend it here from the morning until well into the afternoon. But 4 hours out of 168 doesn't seem like much in the scheme of things. I think church is much more than just a weekly get-together on a Saturday. It's something that extends into every part of our lives. And so often we can come to church and for us it's just an exchange of information, just an exchange of ideas, but I really think it needs to be about transformation and the transforming work of the Spirit within us. So churches that love their method more than their mission will die. Or another way to picture it is imagine this. In the early 2000s, your company has just posted a great profit of many millions. You employ 84,000 people worldwide. You have 9,000 stores worldwide, and your company has just been valued at $3 billion. Life seems awesome. Your company seems to be doing all right. Do you have any idea what company I'm talking about? Blockbuster Video. Fast forward to today. Do we have any Blockbusters around? No. They have declared bankruptcy, and now they even cease to exist. When you say let's watch something, it isn't let's go to Blockbuster, it's let's go to Netflix. They actually had the opportunity to partner with Netflix in the early 2000s, but they declined. See, instead of realizing they were in the film and entertainment distribution, they decided about a particular model. And their model was based on late fees. And see, all of their profit margin came from late fees. That was their method. That's where their profit came from. In fact, one year they made $800 million on late fees alone. They focused on what they did instead of why they did it. Or think about Kodak. They were once the leader for film and the leader for cameras. They controlled 70% of the film market in the 70s and 80s. They actually invented the first digital camera as well. But they decided not to pursue it because they didn't see a future in it. Because most of their profit came from developing the film. Instead of being about photography and encouraging other people to get into photography and championing that cause, they fixated on what they did. One person writes, there are probably a lot of reasons behind their fall, but they didn't change their method. They didn't take risks and try new things, but instead they stayed with what had worked in the past. They had a failure to clarify what their real mission was. Imagine if someone at Kodak had asked, are we in the film business or are we in the photography business? If Kodak was in the film business, the future would be dim. But if Kodak decided that it was in the photography business, the future could have been very different. Or picture it differently, Facebook decided it was in the photography business when it bought Instagram. And Apple decided it was in the photography business when it developed the iPhone. If you were to ask, if you're in the newspaper business today, a great question to ask is this. Are we in the newspaper business or are we in the business of sharing news? Clarifying what it is and why you do what you do. And I think it's the same for us as a church community. Why do we do what we do? Do we just gather here because it's nice to see each other, it's nice to sing a couple songs together? Or is there a mission behind what we do? See, so often in church, we make our methods sacred, our way of doing particular things, the be-all and the end-all. But is it the method that's sacred or is it the mission that matters most? See, if we're going to be the hands and feet of Jesus, if we're going to take the gospel to the world around us, if we're going to be the disciples Jesus calls us to be, we must be tied to the mission of Jesus. You know, when I read the scriptures, and when we read the life of Jesus, not once did he really say how you are to do church. But he did give us a way to be church, to love God and to love other people, and to lead others into a relationship with him. At the end of the day, that's our calling. Our mission isn't just to hold services. It's not just to sing some cool music. It's not even me just preaching. It's about sharing the transforming nature of the gospel message. Our methods, the way we facilitate our service and what we do, whether it be singing songs, whether it be running pathfinders, whether it be doing all these things, they're there to support our mission. So the question is, why are we here and where do we want to go? I love gathering. I love being together as a church, and I truly and honestly believe that the local church is the hope of the world. That's why I've committed to being a pastor. That's why I've dedicated my life to this, because I believe that we, as the people of God, can change the reality of the world around us. We can bring hope and a difference to people's lives. You know, as God's people, we're called to influence the community around us. See, the church, or the people of God, is God's agency on earth. We are called to carry out his plan. And you know, I always used to think, how can I grow the church? How can I grow God's church? But I think a better question to ask, because when I said that, I was so focused on building a service and building a really cool program. But instead, I want to ask the question, how do we grow God's kingdom? How do we grow God's kingdom? And if you have a Bible with you, I just want to go to Matthew chapter 28. If you don't have one, it's all right. I'll put a Bible up here and we'll read it together. This is what it says. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." It's a great text. And often in church circles, especially if you've grown up, this is known as the Great Commission. It's sort of Jesus' charge to not only his disciples, but to all of us. Just a cool few observations from this text. I love that they still doubted. They had been with Jesus for 3.5 years. They had seen him perform miracles, see him work amazing teachings. They've even seen him raise from the dead. Yet here they are, and they still had doubts. See, having doubts is not a lack of faith. Having doubts is part of our journey. However, don't let your doubts stop you from living a life for God. Secondly, he gave them authority. Jesus could have easily accomplished his mission on his own, but he chose to partner with people. And that's a big message of Scripture, that God partners with us. God wants to work with us. Yes, he could do it on his own, but he chooses to partner and to work with us, and so he shares his authority with us. And all throughout history, we see men and women, children even, partner with God to change the history of this world. I love here it says that you are to go to all nations. See, this gospel message is not just for a select group of people, not only some privileged people, not only some privileged places, but it says for all people. Another interesting observation that I find in this text, it says, baptize them and then teach them. Baptize and teach. And so often in church, especially growing up as an Adventist, we can often, make baptism this be-all and end-all. And so we get people to study, we get kids to study, and we get them to make a decision, and we baptize people. We get them to the baptismal font, and we're so excited that they got baptized. And then we dust our hands, and we say everything's done, we've done our work. Baptize and teach, it sort of indicates that this is an ongoing journey. And yeah, I know, teaching is important, and I believe it's important to get some understanding what you're doing before baptism. But I think understanding and growing and learning after baptism is just as important. See, discipleship, what Jesus calls us to, is a life orientated after his. And that's always going to be an ongoing journey. I have this stat here that says, people who were dragged into baptism, who were forced to make this decision. Most people end up leaving the church after 7 years. See, it's not about just getting baptized, but it's about a lifelong journey and relationship with Christ. And see, when I read the scriptures, when I spend time in them and I'm taught by others and we spend time reading and discussing with others, I'm constantly learning and I'm constantly growing and constantly developing my views on who God is and what God can do. And see, often we're so focused and we often share, it's about a personal relationship with Jesus, which it is, but it's not a solo relationship with Jesus, because we are meant and we are designed to do life together. Discipleship isn't something that happens solo. We are called into a relationship with God, but the way we live that out is through authentic community. And so I have this main idea that I've been toying around with and playing with, but it says we're made for community and we're wired for connection. We experience community in a circle, and that's why circles are better than rows. So, look at how church is focused right now. You're all focused on me. This whole church setup is designed to focus on what happens at the front here. But it limits us in how we can connect and share and grow. Is this the be-all and end-all? Look at how Jesus lived his life. Look at what he modeled. How did Jesus spend his time? He spent it in circles. Often you can picture Jesus with the masses, teaching, the many thousands. But if you read the Gospels closely and you put it into percentage and you put it into time, Jesus spent a majority of his time with a very small group of people. He had the 12, and then within the 12, he had a 3. He had an inner circle, an inner group, and he prioritized those people, and he poured into them, and he did life with them. One researcher says this. He says that the Gospels put 3/4 of their emphasis on the training of the 12. He calculates from the time that Jesus told the 12 that he'd teach them to multiply until his death, he spent 73% of his time with the 12. That's 46 events with the few compared to only 17 with the masses. The ratio of time Jesus spent with the few versus the time he spent with the many was almost 3-1. He spent time with them. He lived life with them. He saw the good, the bad, and the ugly in their life. But he was empowering them so that they would go on to do greater things. So in our church communities, in our gatherings, who's in your circle? Who's in your close group of people? Who's helping you to become more and more like Jesus? It's through living in community that Jesus empowered his disciples to disciple others. Through Jesus, we begin to see what he laid out for us when it comes to doing life together. Jesus focuses on the few, knowing that through them, he could eventually reach the multitudes with a genuine thing. See, I believe that the gospel needs to be felt and experienced in our own life. So often we just share facts, or we share ideas, and we share theories about God. And those are all good, but what about the experience that we have with God? How has God made an impact and a difference in our lives? We can't testify to an experience that we've never, ever had. The genius of Christ's ministry was that he devoted himself primarily to a few people rather than the masses, in order that the masses could be more effectively reached with the gospel. Jesus simply organized the disciples into small groups, thus they carried out what they went about. And I love this thought here. It says, Jesus was not concerned with building great institutions. He was concerned with building great people. To Jesus, relationships were the most important thing he talked about. When you read the Gospels, who did Jesus spend time with? He spent time with all sorts of people. He spent time with religious people. He spent time with notorious sinners. What was important to him was authenticity, was relationships, was genuinely connecting with people. He would deliberately go out of his way in order to build a relationship. And so, as people of God, what are we more concerned about as a community? Are we more concerned about the people we can reach or the building that we've built? Are we upholding and valuing people, or do we uphold and value our way of doing things? Jesus was often questioned and often asked and often debated about, what's the most important thing in the law? How do we live out the law? And Jesus summed it up brilliantly. Love God, love people. Love God, love people. But then we mix it up and we ask, well, what about if they're like this? Or what about if they do that? And we just ask all these silly questions, and I love this meme because it puts it like this. Love everyone no matter what. What if they have tattoos? Yes, even if they ask stupid questions. Man, we just try to complicate things when it comes to the gospel. Jesus says, love God, love people no matter what. I love this sign. My friend's a pastor at Castle Hill Church, and out the front of their church, they have this awesome sign. I love that. I just had to take a photo when I go up. But as soon as you walk in, this is what you see. It says, love your neighbor who doesn't look like you, who doesn't think like you, who doesn't love like you, who doesn't speak like you, who doesn't pray like you, who doesn't vote like you. Love your neighbor, no exceptions. But for many of us in church, there's exceptions. Oh, but they do this. Oh, but did you hear? Nah. Love your neighbor. See, we need to surround ourselves with people who don't think or look like us, because so often we can just end up in an echo chamber. But we need to be challenged by the people who aren't like us. And so often, we can end up worshiping a God who is a lot like us. And if God is a lot like us, then we're not necessarily challenged, or we're not necessarily being moved by God's Spirit. See, is God like us, or are we like God? There's a New Testament scholar, his name's Scott McKnight, and he teaches at a university, and he said he would do 2 surveys. And he would do a survey on the students, on their likes and their preferences, and a whole bunch of questions. And then he would give out a second survey with the exact same set of questions, but instead of them, it was for Jesus now. What would Jesus like? What would Jesus value? And the exact same questions. Then he said 90% of the time, the answers were the exact same. So often we can end up worshiping a God who looks exactly like us. But does God challenge us? As a church community, as people of God, what are we prioritizing? Relationships, rules, traditions, or people? If the gospel doesn't lead you to have a heart for others, then I don't think that's the gospel. There is always a need for the gospel because there is always a need for love in this world. In the book that I read earlier, the Table I Long For, it says people are drawn to where they're loved the most. And if we are a loving community, if we are loving people, if we express and show God's love, then people are drawn to that. Because people always have a desire and a need for love. Think about the songs out there. Every second song that becomes a hit is often about love. People desire and long for love, and the gospel is the greatest love that people can long for and experience. So are people drawn to Christ's love? Are we expressing that here? This thought always gets me. It says it's hard to convince people that a God they can't see loves them when a church they can see doesn't seem to like them. What are we showing people? What I love is that Jesus chose very ordinary guys with faults, guys who didn't make the cut, guys who fell short constantly. But he used these people to go on and to change the world. And at the end of the Gospels, they're not even perfect. They don't even have it all together. You'd think after spending 3 years with Jesus that, hey, maybe they might be close. But no. There's still lots of work for them to do in their life, and it's the same for us. There's constantly work to be done. Jesus is constantly wanting to transform and to change us. See, think about this. The disciples had come from all kinds of dysfunctional groups and families. James and John came from a home where their mother has always pushed them to get ahead of others and to be in control. Simon, we read, was a zealot. He was a member of a political group that tried to gain control by military power. Matthew used the power of Rome to enforce unwanted taxes on the populace. Would you use these people to go on and build a community? Probably not. Yet Jesus worked with sinful, broken people. And when you read the Gospels and when you see the stories, they didn't trust each other at first. They were trying to be better than one another. They were constantly fighting and bickering. They were not open, and they were not vulnerable, but instead they were judgmental. But Jesus worked in and through them because they were going to represent a whole new community. Jesus chose them to demonstrate that he can use all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds, from all kinds of dysfunctional homes. Because in him we can discover real community. Jesus' model of ministry indicated that dysfunctional people can be radically changed by the gospel so that they can experience real community. All of us are somewhat dysfunctional. Jesus' model gives us the hope that he can transform us into people who reside in him and with each other. We all need Jesus every single day. Jesus makes this statement on what new community looks like in Matthew 12. He says, while Jesus was still talking to the crowds, his mother and brother stood outside, wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, your mother and brother are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and here are my brothers. For whoever does the will of the Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Jesus' new community transcends the natural family. People who are drawn to him are part of a brand new family. The language that Jesus uses is very relational, and that's the community that we need to be. For a long time, I always prided myself in having and creating a friendly church. Yeah, let's be a friendly church. And I think it's great. Yes, we should be a friendly church. But being a friendly church can be superficial. Because for an hour, all you have to do is put on a smile, shake hands, get to know people, and then you can say goodbye. And then you can repeat the process the next weekend. It can be a very pseudo-community. But in the book, The Table I Long For, he says, instead of being a friendly church, we need to be a family church. Because family have dysfunctions. Family have fights. Families, it can be rough at times, but there is a deep love within families. There is a love in families that transcends friendliness. And that's the community that Jesus calls us into. In Matthew 18:20, Jesus proclaimed these words, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am. There I am. The gospel is not a solo exercise. Living life with Jesus is not a solo exercise. To help us understand that the small group is the very essence of church, Jesus shared that even with 2 or 3 people, there he is among them. Jesus is telling us that the small group is church, not a part of church, but the essence of church. It is the gathered community of the 12 that became the church community. Instead of looking at small groups as another program of the church, we need to start looking at them as if they are the church. For that is what Jesus has declared them to be. Not yet. A quote that I didn't put up, but it says this. It says, the Christian community is a place where we can start to practice the Christian life together. It needs to be a place where we can succeed and fail in an atmosphere of acceptance and adherence to God's words. The reality of our life, our Christian walk, is to become more and more like Jesus, to put into play his life and live it out in our life. So as a community, how do we orientate ourselves around the way and the teachings of Jesus? How do we live it out together? We learn, we practice, we talk, we communicate, we share. The purpose of groups is to give Christians a place where they can grow together. I remember when I was at Avondale College, there was this massive emphasis on doing life in groups together. And it was awesome. And they had all sorts of groups. See, so often with church, we can just make it about like Bible studies and Bible study groups. And yes, they're great. And I love Bible study groups. But at College Church, they emphasized doing life together. And so they had all sorts of groups. Yes, they had the Bible study groups. But then they had groups like Taco Tuesday. And a group of people would just to get together every Tuesday, and all they did was eat tacos and pray. Another group did Sunday cleanup, where they just got together and they picked a place and they just went and cleaned the community together. A group I was a part of was called Indian Kitchen. There was this guy, he just really loved cooking Indian food. And he wanted to teach others how to cook Indian food. And so I signed up to this class, and I get to this class and this group of people, and everybody is 40 years my senior. It was just a group of older people. It was not what I expected. I thought this was a college church life group where all the college-age students. But I loved it because I got to know all these people I wouldn't have known otherwise. And every week we'd just get together, we'd cook an Indian meal, we'd eat it, and then we'd also listen to each other's story. We'd hear the journey that God had taken people on. And so instead of getting to church on Saturday and just saying hello, but it'd be, oh, hey Ruth, how are you? How was your week? And I would actually have this conversation with Ruth. Or I'd have this conversation with Richard, all these people that I built a relationship with, and many of these people I'm still in contact with today. See, doing a small group doesn't just have to be a Bible study. See, in Adventist churches, we often say small groups are all right as long as they stick to a Bible study. All groups need to be studies. But if intellectual knowledge alone is being attained from the Bible study, then the small group is a failure because its true purpose is spiritual growth, not intellectual attainment. Groups only for intellectual pursuits are in a sense dysfunctional. Yes, it's important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. So often I find that we can be afraid of developing deep relationships in community with one another. We need to be in a group in order to hold each other accountable for our life in Christ and to truly care for one another. Perhaps we are fearful of relational groups because we don't want to be accountable to each other, or we don't want to witness to one another. In a sense, our Bible study groups or our intellectual groups are safe because we don't have to open up and be vulnerable with each other. But such groups do not create real Christians, only pseudo ones. If all that occurs in this group is intellectual, it's not genuine to the gospel. It needs to be both head and heart knowledge. Not just a change of information, but transformation within. So often we can be proud of the truth that we hold. But often the truth that we hold can stop us from loving other people. And if the truth that we discover in the Bible doesn't lead us to love others, then it's not the Bible. I just want to share from the table I long for. It says this. It says, we need to be safe people for others to share their stories with. When they come to us with their pain, trauma, and shame, it's a sacred moment. It's a gift from that person, and it's a gift from God. Brené Brown notes that shame requires 3 things in order to grow out of control in our lives: secrecy, silence, and judgment. But it loses its power when it is spoken out loud. I used to think that listening to people earned me the right to witness to them later. But then I realized that in a world full of self-absorbed and judgmental people, listening itself is the witness. It is a critically important gospel work that cannot be neglected. If we want people to experience God's grace, it helps them feel validated, heard, and loved, which is incredibly healing and yet tragically uncommon. So many of us are unsafe people, though. We're quick to judge, advise, critique, shame, and try to convert. We think people need our Bible verses, when all they really need is our listening ears. When we listen, we're embodying very Bible verses that we think we need to quote. People will gravitate to where they are most loved. So when we live our lives, when we live our lives as people of God, are people drawn to Christ's love in us? Small relational groups are the heart of Christianity, and it must be the heart of the Adventist church. If we are serious about being the church of Jesus, for Jesus' church is deeply relational. A relational church is one of the greatest needs in the world that is starving for relationships. When I was at college, I had this guy that I met. His name was Julian. Julian came to college in 2017. He grew up in WA, and he had no idea about God. He even had no idea about Adventists. But his mum found Avondale College because apparently it was one of the best places that you could do outdoor recreation. And so his mum signed him up to come to Avondale College. And if you ever come to Avondale College, it's in Curramong, which is in the middle of nowhere. And so Julian flies from WA over to college, catches the train, and then one of the security guards picked him up from the train station. Weird experience to begin with, but he stuck around. At the end of 2017, I got to know Julian because we went on a mission trip together. And we actually shared a room, which I didn't plan for. I planned to room with another friend, but I somehow ended up with Julian. And we began talking, and we began sharing, and we began hearing each other's stories. And it was great. We had a lot of commonality, we had a lot of similar ideas, but they were based off different values. They were coming from different places. I love Julian. He was great, and he loved me, and we developed this really awesome friendship. And in 2018, we actually roomed right next to each other, and most nights we'd just be in each other's rooms talking and sharing and discussing. And yeah, while he didn't believe in God to begin with, he went on this journey with me, and I went on this journey with him where we were talking with one another. We were sharing with one another. And we found out that we have a lot of similar ideas, and we have a lot of similar values. And he saw where mine came from. They came from God and what I see in Scripture. And because he saw that in me, and then he began to see it in the boys around, he began to think, and he began to see, maybe there is a God. Maybe there is more to all of this. And I remember later that year, I went through a season in my life where I was going through a lot of difficulties, and I was going through a lot of challenges, and life was quite rough, and it felt overwhelming. And I remember Julian, who people looked at as the outdoor recce. People looked at as the bad, naughty boy. Julian was the one who organized a prayer meeting for me because he saw the value and the importance, and he knew I valued prayer. And so he got all these boys together to show up in a room and to pray for me. It wasn't my Christian friends. It wasn't the theology friends that I do theology with. It was this Julian, the outdoor recce, the one who I did life with and shared a relationship with, that said, hey, I know prayer is important for you, so I'm going to organize this prayer meeting. And it was one of the most overwhelming things I've been a part of, and it was amazing. I remember there was this, we had this week of worship at Avondale, and at the end of it, they're calling for baptism and stuff, and I was sitting next to Julian, and I was like, yes, he's going to make a decision. He's going to do it here. And he doesn't get up. And I turn to him and I say, do you want to get baptized? And he says no. And I was so disappointed. But then we were driving later that week, and he turns to me and he says, you know what? I do want to get baptized. But just not here. Just not here at this church. Because he could see that the people at the church weren't concerned about him. The people who were concerned about him were that small group of boys that did life together with him. And so he does want to get baptized. And I haven't heard from Julian in a while, but I still check in from him from time to time. And I remember when we were leaving college, he said, boys, can you pray for me? Can you help me to understand where God is leading and guiding me? And it was cool. This guy who came, who had absolutely no understanding about God, about Adventist, about church, experienced God, experienced the gospel through time spent together. Church service is great, but we exist so much more than just a church service. How can we live out the mission of God? How can we look at spending life together? I think as a church community, we do have the essence of it. We have our Adra kitchen where we serve. That's a group that we have. But what else can we do? And so I just want to take a moment to be practical here. I'm going to put up a QR code on the screen. Hopefully you can scan it. But I just want to collect some information and some ideas on times and on things that we can do where we might be able to gather throughout the week, where we might be able to spend time with one another in building this sort of community. So I want to take a moment to do that, and when you do, I might invite the band to come up as well.